The war on drugs, although considered a success by some, was a failure to control the drug population and usage, and in some cases made drugs more of a problem. During the 1970s and through the 90s, two main movements were started. The first one started in the 1970s by Ronald Reagan, and the second movement was started in the 1980s and continues to this day. Most illegal drugs, such as marijuana and cocaine, have been used for medical purposes for thousands of years. The drug laws prior to the 1970s were meant to discriminate against minorities, such as the law taxing opium, which targeted Chinese Americans. Another one of these drug-restricting laws banned cocaine, which adversely impacted the primary African Americans. And another law was to ban marijuana, which affected mostly the Hispanic community. These drugs were banned only because of the ethnic group that they were associated with at the time, not the actual purposes and dangers of the drug. The prime example of this today is marijuana, which is a harmless drug when used over the age of 21. The drug is only lethal in impossibly high doses. The drug problem in the 70s was minimal. During this time, only 2 to 6% of the U.S. population believed that drugs were the nation's #1 problem. This belief was expanded when Nixon went into office, who believed that drugs were, quote, public enemy #1 of the United States. He began by increasing the presence of drugs agencies and the power for this new reform. Nixon's goal during the war on drugs was to disrupt two different communities, the hippies and the African Americans. To do this, Nixon associated the African Americans with the drug heroin and the hippies with marijuana. The purpose of this was to, quote, arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news, according to the assistant to the president for domestic affairs, John Eckerman, who worked under President Nixon. The war on drugs in the 1960s to the early 70s was an act of racism targeted against minorities than an actual solution to the drug problem. After Nixon was kicked out of office, 11 states had decriminalized possession of marijuana. President Jimmy Carter also would start a campaign to criminalize the drug. That wouldn't be so much the case with the second part of the war on drugs, which started in the 80s with the, quote, drug hysteria, when parents pushed for laws against marijuana and other drugs such as cocaine. The media attacked these drugs by showing people who are addicted to crack, which is the slang word for cocaine. The way for the president, Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan, started the campaign, Just Say No. All of these events led up to the zero-tolerance laws being passed eventually. Major penalties were enacted, which, with most non-violent drug offenders going to prison. The political perspective on drugs wasn't the only thing changing. The people's perspective on drugs was, too. A study showed that 64% of Americans believe that drugs are the nation's #1 problem, compared to the 2 to 6% people who believed the same thing over 10 years ago. Gradually, this rate would go down to 10% as the media lost interest, but the laws in the town would remain. The effects of the war on drugs during the 70s through 1990s may seem simple at first, but they go much deeper. The no-tolerance laws created discrimination, as specific drug bans targeted different groups of people. The laws also disproportionately impacted people of color, as people of color were more likely to go to prison for the non-violent drug offenses. The population of prisons skyrocketed, as the prison population went from just under 200,000 in 1970 to 1.5 million by the turn of the 21st century to the mandatory prison sentences for possession of drugs. The war on drugs was a complete failure in the United States, and all it managed to do was create stricter laws that made for more discrimination against minorities. The effects of the war on drugs can not only be seen in the 70s and 80s, but also in today's time. However, new laws are being passed to reverse the adverse and discriminatory sentencing guidelines that arose from the war on drugs. The current movement is to decriminalize drug offenses and treat drug addiction more as a medical condition than a criminal behavior.